I start with the first section on race, ethnicity, and for this discussion, I'm looking at the article that you guys all read. This is the article by Glenn Lowry called Racial Stigma and Its Consequences. If you're interested in the arguments that Professor Lowry makes, you can check out his book called The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, where he lays out in more detail his argument, so you can always check that out. We'll look at his very brief article. I'll go ahead and summarize some of the main arguments that come out of the bridged version, and so we'll talk about that first. The basic idea, the basic thesis in this particular article is the notion that African Americans or blacks, because of racial stigma, have not been able to realize their full potential. So it's the role of racial stigma in prohibiting African Americans to realize their full potential. This is the thesis in this section. Professor Lowry notes that these terms such as racism or discrimination have much different meanings than what they did back in the 1960s in the civil rights era, and so he'll lay out later on what those terms mean today, what those terms mean for us today, especially in terms of thinking about inequality between different races. And so in thinking about this inequality that we see today, whether it's in terms of education or employment or any other setting for that matter, he starts out by saying that this sort of disparity that we see between the races is not due to inherent differences in capacities, but due to social or cultural factors. So he uses the language of human development. He says that there's a disparity in human development. I don't think it's what we're accustomed to thinking about when we're thinking about the term human development. I think he's just talking about disparities in terms of education and employment. So just to recap, basically he's looking at the reasons why we see inequality between the races in different areas. That's where he starts. He's talking about race in his article, the notion of race as a biological concept. We start with the presumption that race is deeply ingrained in our society. We all have a sense of what race means in our society. The term race has changed over time. He notes that there are both objective and subjective notions of race. This gets into sort of a philosophical discussion about what race really is. Is there some objective reality called race that's apart from individual consciousness, or is race simply a social construction? Is it something that's created in our own minds? Everyone has their own individual concept of race. Which is it? Is it objective or is it subjective? So he's starting with this discussion. You have some arguments on the objectivist side. Subjectivists may say that there is something called race, right? Some objective notion of race. You can classify people on the basis of race by looking at their skin color. You can look at hair texture. You can look at facial features, and classify people, right, according to race. He says from an objectivist side. But then he also points out subjectivist arguments. I think there's no question here that he's making a subjectivist argument. I think he's suggesting that we've all internalized the meaning of race, that we all have our individual notions of race. So we've attached certain meanings to different races in our own minds, he's suggesting, I think, here. So on the divide between objectivist notions and subjectivist notions of race, I would characterize him certainly on the more subjectivist side here. And so as an example, he says, look at the illustration of a cab driver. He says, take the example of a cab driver in a big city. And let's say the cab driver is reluctant to stop for young African-American males, under the presumption that there may be a greater rate of crime or a greater propensity for crime. And so if we think further, it may be that if you look at the crime statistics, that this may be the case, that this may in fact reinforce our notions of associating race with higher crime rates among certain races or ethnicities. But then he goes on to say that we could certainly explain this away by adverse selection also. It's not just that certain races are more prone towards crime. This can be a simple case of adverse selection. We've talked about this notion of adverse selection before, but in this particular context, he lays out the processes by which this may be explained by adverse selection. So he says, take the case of the cab driver once again in a big city, and if it so happens that young African-American males find it difficult to catch a cab, then the ones who do remain for purposes of catching a cab may be the ones who are most likely to catch a cab or to rob the cab driver. And if that's so, then certainly the crime statistic, that might be what the crime statistics are reflecting. And so the basic notion here is that he's explaining away this differential in terms of the crime statistics as a simple matter of adverse selection. That's one subjective use of race that he's given us an example of. And so he notes that this is a vicious cycle, but he says his exact language there is a vicious circle of cumulative causation. So we start with this notion of race, and we attach certain meanings to race, right? That young African American males are more likely to rob the cab driver, and if it so happens that the cab driver has that experience, for example, right, of being robbed by a young African American male, then that initial notion gets reinforced, right? This vicious circle of causation. He gives a second example. He gives an example of a commercial loan officer. He says, let's say the commercial loan officer refuses to extend credit on commercial loans because the loan officer thinks that blacks are going to be more likely to default on the loan. And if it so happens that blacks have more difficulty in extending their credit in times of crises, then it reinforces that initial notion. So once again, it's another example of a vicious circle of cumulative causation he's noting here. And so this whole discussion begs the question of, well, where did these original preconceived notions that are attached to different races, where did this come from? Well, in terms of the black experience, he says it comes from the history of chattel slavery in this country and the racial dishonor that blacks and African Americans experience. So he does note that other groups, other ethnic and racial groups, did in fact experience racial dishonor in some other respects. So he notes the experience of Irish immigrants, of Chinese immigrants, of Jewish immigrants, but he says that the African American experience is exceptional because of this institution of chattel slavery, and the extent of racial dishonor is somewhat distinguishable from other different ethnicities. And so in developing a theory of racial inequality, he says that we can explain racial inequality in two different ways, essentially. We can think about reward bias, and we can think about development bias. Reward bias would be a situation where different people of different races are receiving different rewards for essentially the same type of work. That's one way in which inequality might be generated. Another way in which inequality might be generated is through processes. So it may be that one group doesn't have the same opportunities as members from another ethnic or racial group. That's the development bias argument. And so between these two processes, he says we need to look more closely at development bias. He says the key to addressing any sort of racial inequality is to look at the development biases that exist in our society. And so he's distinguishing between two different types of discrimination that occur in the process, right? In the process in which inequality may come about. He distinguishes between discrimination in contract and discrimination in contact. So he notes that discrimination in contract is the more formal type. So this is unequal treatment on the basis of race in formal transactions. So in an educational setting, in an employment setting, for example, the more formal type of discrimination. And then there's discrimination in contact. This would be discrimination in informal settings. So our everyday life. So in our social life, in our everyday interactions with people, this is the type of discrimination that he's referring to here. So certainly, the more formal type, discrimination in contract, he says, has been outlawed. With the civil rights legislation, we can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in the education setting, in the employment setting, in housing, with respect to different areas. So that's been prescribed, but he argues that discrimination in contact, the more informal type, he says that should remain in our society, and he gives his reasons why. He says first that if we're to respect people's liberties, people's autonomy, their right to make decisions for themselves, we must allow that to remain. Also, on a more personal level, he notes that he doesn't see necessarily anything wrong if a person of a particular race doesn't feel like associating with someone of a different race. So he gives those two rationales for why discrimination in contact must remain. But of course, he notes that discrimination contact, the more informal type, while not as egregious on its face, it could be just as debilitating for African Americans, he says. So he's talking about his theory of racial inequality, and he's an economist, mind you. So typically, economists will focus on human capital related factors. So your earnings potential, your educational background, your employment history, the prestige of your education and your employment. So these factors, your earnings potential, these are typically the province of economists. But he's saying that we need to look beyond individual level factors, that there could be social factors at work. So he encourages us in building his theory of racial inequality to look beyond human capital theory and to look at social capital, namely the impact of racial stigma and how that affects racial inequality. And so that's his basic theory of racial inequality, and we can think about what these notions might mean for policy. So what might be the implications of assuming that race is in fact objective versus subjective, and what do we do with those notions on a policy level? So we can think about those via this article.